What is the difference between a pioneer and a pirate? That is the question you have to ask yourself when you are standing in the rain at 3 in the morning, watching a cargo plane taxi down a runway that doesn't officially exist. History tells us that the men who built America, the Rockefellers, the Carnegies, the Vanderbilts, they were visionaries. But if you look at the blood on their hands, if you look at how they strangled the competition to control the oil, the steel, the railroads, you realize they were just gangsters who learned how to wear a tie. I learned that lesson from Bumpy Johnson. He taught me that a man who asks for permission is a man who waits in line, and waiting in line is for suckers. Bumpy owned Harlem, but he was limited by the street. He was the king of the block, but I didn't want the block. I wanted the supply chain. November 24th, 1970, 3:14 a.m. We were at a private airfield in North Carolina, a long way from 116th Street. The air smelled of wet asphalt, pine needles, and high-octane jet fuel. My cousin Jackson was shivering next to me, not from the cold, but from the reality of what we were doing. We weren't buying from the Italians anymore. We weren't buying from the Jewish syndicates or the crooked cops who stepped on the product 4 times before it even hit the sidewalk. We had done what no one else in the history of the underworld had the stomach to do. We went to the source. We went to the jungle. The cargo bay doors of the C-130 opened with a mechanical whine that cut through the silence. Inside, lined up in respectful rows, were 6 aluminum caskets. American boys coming home from a war that nobody understood, returning to a country that was too busy fighting with itself to care. I took my hat off. Not out of fear, but out of respect. These boys had paid the ultimate price, and in doing so, they had become the vessels for the ultimate product. "Is it there, Frank?" Jackson whispered, his voice cracking. He was looking at the military police guarding the perimeter, men on my payroll, but men with M16s nonetheless. "Quiet," I said. My voice was calm. It has to be. Panic is a scent, and it attracts wolves. We walked up the ramp. The hum of the plane's engines was still vibrating in the floorboards. I approached the 3rd casket on the left. Corporal James Miller. I didn't know him, but I thanked him. I produced a crowbar from my trench coat. It wasn't about disrespecting the dead. It was about financing the living. The Italians, they were selling garbage. Brown stepped on trash that was 10% heroin and 90% milk sugar. They were insulting the customer. I don't believe in insults. I believe in branding. I believe in blue magic. I wedged the iron under the false bottom of the casket. With a groan of metal, it popped. Beneath the body, packed in airtight waterproof plastic, sat 50 kilos of the purest heroin Southeast Asia could produce. 100% pure, no cut, no middleman, no markup. I took a knife, slit the plastic, and dipped the tip of the blade into the white powder. I brought it to my tongue. It tasted like electricity. It tasted like power. It tasted like the end of the Italian Mafia in Harlem. Jackson was sweating. "Frank, if they catch us, we go to jail," I cut him off, wiping the blade on my coat. "But if we pull this off, we don't just run Harlem. We own the board. We aren't hustlers tonight, Jackson. We are importers. We are investment bankers. We are the new face of American enterprise." I looked at the kilos. Millions of dollars sitting under a dead soldier. It was a grim irony, but business is always grim if you look at it too closely. The Italians were charging $50,000 a key for garbage. I was getting this for $2,000 and selling it as the finest product on the street. I closed the casket. I patted the lid. The rain started to fall harder, drumming against the aluminum. I turned to Jackson, who was still shaking, still thinking like a street corner dealer. He didn't see the vision. He didn't see that we had just cut the head off the snake. Bumpy Johnson walked so I could run, but tonight I wasn't running. I was flying. I buttoned my coat, checked my watch, and looked out at the dark runway. The world was changing. The old guard was dying out, choking on their own inefficiency. Tonight was the changing of the guard. My man, my product, my city. To understand what I did, You have to understand the architecture of the cage we were living in. Harlem in the late 60s wasn't just a neighborhood, it was a plantation. The masters didn't live in the big house anymore. They lived on Pleasant Avenue and out in Long Island, eating veal parmigiana and laughing at the black man trying to scrape $1 out of a dime. The hierarchy was set in stone, or at least they thought it was. At the top sat the 5 families: Gambino, Genovese, Lucchese, Colombo, Bonanno. They controlled the ports, the unions, and the supply. Beneath them were the middlemen, the bloated parasites who took the product, stepped on it with quinine, milk sugar, and strychnine, and then sold it to the black gangsters at a markup that would make a loan shark blush. By the time a kilo of heroin hit 116th Street, it had been touched by 10 different hands, and every hand took a piece of the soul out of it. Bumpy Johnson, God rest his soul, was a king, but he was a king within their borders. He fought them for respect. He outsmarted them like he did with Ray Ray and that poisoned wine, but he was still buying from them. He was still the customer, and the customer is never the boss. I looked at Bumpy's struggle, and I realized that fighting the Italians for territory was a waste of ammunition. You don't fight the landlord, you buy the building. I didn't want a seat at their table. I built my own damn table. The problem was the middleman. The middleman is the enemy of profit. Every time a package changes hands, the price goes up and the purity goes down. The Italians were selling us garbage, brown sludge that was maybe 10% pure if you were lucky, and charging us $50,000 for the privilege. They thought we were stupid. They thought we couldn't read a map or check a stock ticker. They were wrong. I looked at the war in Vietnam and I didn't see a political disaster. I saw a logistics channel. I saw a direct line to the Golden Triangle, where the poppy fields stretched out like white oceans and the product was 98% pure. I bypassed the mob. I bypassed the Jewish syndicates. I bypassed the corrupt customs agents at JFK who wanted their envelopes. I recruited my family, the country boys from North Carolina, men who knew how to work, who knew how to keep their mouths shut, and who looked at me not just as a boss but as blood. We instituted a new regime, and I cemented my power not by shooting people in the street, but by rendering the competition obsolete. Let me tell you how power really looks. It isn't a gun in your face. It's the look in a man's eyes when he realizes he's irrelevant. The first example was Detective Richie Roberts' colleagues, the Special Investigations Unit. They called them the princes of the city. They walked around Harlem like they owned the pavement, collecting tribute. One night, a sergeant named O'Malley came to me at a club on 125th. He was used to the old way. He wanted his envelope, $5,000 a month to let me operate. He stood there, chest puffed out, waiting for me to haggle. I didn't haggle. I handed him an envelope with $10,000 in it. He looked at the cash, then at me, confused. I told him, "That's not for protection, Sergeant. I don't need protection. That is a retainer. From now on, you don't look the other way. You look exactly where I tell you. If I say a car is clean, it's clean. If I say a corner belongs to me, you arrest anyone else standing on it." I bought the law. I didn't rent it. I made the police force my private security detail, and I did it by paying them more than the city ever could. O'Malley walked out of there working for Frank Lucas, and he thanked me for the privilege. The second example was the Italians themselves. A capo from the Genovese family, a guy named Fat Tony, called a sit-down. He was angry. His dealers were starving because nobody wanted their brown trash anymore. Everyone wanted blue magic. He sat across from me in a diner, smelling of garlic and entitlement, and told me I had to pay a tax for operating in their city. He threatened to cut off my supply. I laughed. It was a quiet laugh, the kind Bumpy used to give before things went bad. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a sample of blue magic. I slid it across the table. "I don't need your supply, Tony," I said. "Test that." He looked at it. He knew what it was. I told him, "That is 100% pure. I'm selling it for half of what you charge for that dirt you peddle. You can't cut me off because I don't buy from you. In fact, if you want to stay in business, maybe I should be the one charging you a tax." The realization hit him like a physical blow. The supply chain had flipped. The lion was now buying steaks from the gazelle. He left that diner without saying another word, and the Genovese family never asked me for a tax again. The third example, and the most important one, was the street itself. You can bribe cops and scare Italians, but the street doesn't lie. I branded my product. Blue Magic, I put it in blue glassine bags. It was a seal of quality. In a world of liars, I was the only honest merchant. One afternoon, I drove down 116th Street in my car, just watching. There was a line of people, 4 blocks long, waiting for my distributors. But across the street, there was a dealer named Nicky Barnes, a flamboyant guy who liked the spotlight. He was trying to sell his product, jumping up and down, shouting. Nobody was looking at him. His product was inferior. His business model was flawed. He was a dinosaur screaming at a meteor. I watched my competition go bankrupt simply because they couldn't compete with my excellence. I didn't have to fire a single shot at Nicky that day. The market killed him for me. That is the hierarchy I built. I took the pyramid and I turned it upside down. I was no longer the black gangster fighting for scraps. I was the wholesaler. I was the connection. I was the man who brought corporate efficiency to the drug trade. Bumpy Johnson taught me dignity, but I taught myself capitalism. And in America, capitalism is the only gun that never runs out of bullets. But when you climb that high, when you stand that tall, you become a lightning rod. The Italians were quiet, but they were plotting. The cops were paid, but they were greedy. And the higher I went, the thinner the air got. I thought I had cut out all the middlemen, but I was about to learn that there is always someone trying to take a cut, and sometimes the betrayal doesn't come from your enemies. It comes from the people who smile at you across the dinner table. The caskets were just the beginning. The real war was about to start, and this time it wouldn't be fought with poisoned wine. It would be fought with indictments, informants, and the full weight of the United States government. But in 1970, standing in that rain, I was untouchable. I was Frank Lucas, and I owned the world. They say that in ancient Rome, Caesar didn't fear the Gauls or the armies of the north. He feared the whisper in the Senate. He feared the handshake that held a dagger. I always liked reading about Rome. It taught me that an empire isn't destroyed by the barbarians at the gate. It is destroyed by the rotting of the wood from the inside. By 1971, I was Caesar. I had the legions. I had the gold. I had the adoration of the people on 116th Street. But I also had the Senate, and the Senate was getting restless. It was January 14th. The city was frozen solid, a block of gray ice that trapped the exhaust fumes and the anger down at street level. I received a message at the unseen hours of the morning, delivered by a kid who couldn't have been more than 12 years old. He handed me a matchbook from a place called the Slaughterhouse, a meatpacking plant over in the meatpacking district, way west, where the blood from the cattle used to run into the gutters and freeze before it hit the Hudson River. Inside the matchbook was a time, midnight, and a single name. Most men would have packed a bag and run. When the Italians call you to a slaughterhouse at midnight, they aren't planning to discuss the pasta sauce recipe. They are planning to hang you on a meat hook. But I didn't run. Running implies guilt, or worse, fear. And I had built a reputation on the fact that Frank Lucas does not run. I prepared. I put on my best suit, a custom 3-piece sharkskin, tailored in Milan, ironically enough. I put on my overcoat, the cashmere soft against the cold, and I checked the clip in my piece, not because I intended to use it, but because a man who walks into a lion's den without a whip is just a snack. I took my cousin Jackson and 2 of the biggest country boys I had, heavy hitters who looked like linebackers and moved like dancers. We drove in silence. The city lights blurred past, streaks of yellow and red. I looked out the window and thought about the nature of success. Success makes you a target. The Italians were hemorrhaging money. Every bag of blue magic I sold was money out of their pockets. I had embarrassed them. I had outthought them. And now They wanted to correct the error. We pulled up to the warehouse. It was a brick fortress, dark, smelling of old copper and wet sawdust. The wind whipped off the river, cutting through clothes, cutting through skin. We walked in. The main floor was a cavern of hanging carcasses, sides of beef suspended on chains, swaying slightly in the draft. It was theater. The mob loved theater. They thought if they surrounded you with death, you'd be too scared to negotiate. I just saw inventory. In the back office, under a single naked bulb that swung back and forth, sat the counsel. There was Sal, the butcher Tessiero, a capo who had reportedly cut a man's tongue out in 1958. There was Vinny, the Chin Gigantes rep, a guy named Paulie with eyes like a shark. And there were 4 soldiers standing in the shadows, hands in their coats, trying to look ominous. I walked in and didn't sit down. I stood there, letting the silence stretch. I let them look at me. I let them see the suit. I let them see the confidence. I wanted them to know that I wasn't there to beg. "Frankie," Sal said. His voice was gravel and smoke. "You're a hard man to get a hold of." "I'm a busy man, Sal," I said, keeping my tone even. "I have a business to run. A global business. Unlike this, whatever this is." I gestured to the hanging meat. Sal didn't smile. "That's what we're here to talk about. Your business. It's causing a disruption in the market. A severe disruption. You're selling too cheap, Frankie. You're flooding the streets with product that's too strong. The junkies are dropping dead, and the police are bringing the heat down on everybody. It's bad for the ecosystem." "It's called capitalism, Sal," I replied. "It's called a superior product at a competitive price. If your product wasn't stepped on garbage, maybe you wouldn't be losing market share." Paulie leaned forward. "We aren't asking for marketing advice. We're telling you how it's going to be. From now on, you buy through us. We control the ports. We control the unions. You bring your product in, you hand it to us, we distribute it, and we give you 30%. That's the offer." I laughed. It was a genuine laugh. 30%? I own the source, Paulie. I own the jungle. I fly it in on birds you can't even see. I don't need your ports. I don't need your unions. And I certainly don't need your permission. Sal sighed like a disappointed father. "We thought you might say that. See, Frankie, you think you're an island. You think because you got your family, your country boys, that you're insulated. But nobody is insulated. Everybody has a price. Everybody has a weak link." Sal snapped his fingers. From the shadows behind the meat lockers, a door opened. A man walked out. He was looking at the floor, unable to lift his head. My heart didn't break. It just turned into a cold stone in the center of my chest. It was Nate. Nate was my blood. My cousin. The boy I had brought up from North Carolina when he had nothing but holes in his shoes. I had put him in a penthouse. I had given him a territory. I had trusted him with the location of the processing plants in the Bronx. He was wearing a leather jacket I had bought him for Christmas. He was shaking, sweating despite the freezing temperature of the locker. "Look at me, Nate," I said. My voice was soft. Nate looked up. His eyes were red, rimmed with tears and terror. "I'm sorry, Frank," he whispered. They said they'd kill me. They said they'd take it all." "He told us everything, Frankie," Sal said, grinning now, showing yellow teeth. "He told us where the stash houses are. He told us about the Asian connection. He told us the schedule of the planes coming into North Carolina. We know it all. So now the deal changes. You give us everything. The routes, the contacts, the infrastructure. You retire. Maybe we let you keep a nice house in Jersey. Or we kill you right here, and Nate runs the business for us." I looked at Nate. I looked at the man I had treated like a son. I saw the weakness in his jaw. I saw the greed that had festered under the fear. He didn't just turn because he was scared. He turned because he wanted to be the king. He thought if I was gone, he could wear the crown. He didn't understand that the crown is heavy and it crushes weak necks. The Italians were smiling. They thought the game was over. They thought they had checkmate. You poor stupid bastards, I said. The smile dropped off Sal's face. Excuse me? I took a step forward. You think I built an empire by being blind? You think I walked into this room without knowing who was in it? I reached into my pocket. The 4 soldiers behind Sal drew their guns. My country boys drew theirs. It was a standoff, but I didn't pull a gun. I pulled out a folded piece of paper. You operate on fear, Sal, I said, unfolding the paper. You think fear is the only currency? But there is a currency more valuable than fear. Information. And in this city, the people who have the information aren't the guys with the guns. It's the people you don't see. The people you ignore. I tossed the paper onto the table in front of Sal. That, I said, pointing at the paper, is a transcript of the conversation you had with Nate 3 days ago at the diner on Queens Boulevard. I know what he ordered. Eggs over easy. I know what you offered him. $200,000 in my spot at the head of the table. Sal looked at the paper. His face went pale. How? Your driver, I said. Jimmy. He likes to play the numbers. He owes a lot of money to a lot of people. I bought his debt. Now he works for me. He has a tape recorder under the front seat of your Cadillac. I turned to Paulie. And you, Paulie? You have a mistress in the village. A lovely girl. She works as a coat check at the Copacabana. She listens. She hears you bragging when you're drunk. She told me you were planning this meeting a week ago. I looked at Nate. He was trembling so hard he looked like he was having a seizure. And Nate, I said, shaking my head, you didn't think it was strange that the processing plant I sent you to inspect yesterday was empty? You didn't think it was strange that the schedule I gave you for the planes was for flights that don't exist? Nate's eyes went wide. You knew? I knew before you even sat down with them, I said. I knew the moment the thought crossed your mind. You see, I don't just pay my soldiers. I pay the doormen. I pay the maids. I pay the waitresses. I pay the people who clean your toilets and park your cars. I own the eyes and ears of this city. There is not a whisper in Harlem, or Little Italy, or Queens that doesn't find its way back to me. The room was silent. The only sound was the hum of the freezer units. The Italians looked at each other. They realized their leverage was gone. The information Nate had given them was poison. It was fake. They had nothing. So, I said, buttoning my coat, here is the new deal. There is no 30%. There is no partnership. You stay out of my way. You stay out of my territory. If I see one of your dealers on my blocks, I won't kill him. I'll kill the man who sent him. I'll kill the man who drives him. I'll burn your business to the ground from the inside out because I know where you sleep. I know where you eat. And I know where you hide your money. Sal looked at the soldiers. He looked at me. He did the math. If a firefight started, they might get me, but my boys outside, and he had to assume there were more outside, would flatten the place. And even if they survived, I had just revealed that I had compromised their entire operation. I had them wired. What about him? Sal asked, nodding at Nate. I looked at my cousin. The traitor. In the movies, the villain screams. In real life, he just cries. Nate was crying, silent tears running down his face, mixing with the sweat. He's family, I said. Nate looked up, a glimmer of hope in his eyes. But family, I continued, my voice dropping to a whisper, is about loyalty, and you resigned from the family 3 days ago. I turned my back on Nate. I looked at Jackson. I gave him a single nod. Handle it, I said. Frank, please, Nate screamed. Frank, I'm sorry, I'm sorry. I walked toward the door. I didn't look back. Behind me, there was a scuffle, a muffled plea, and then the distinct wet sound of a knife doing work. It wasn't loud. Death doesn't have to be loud. It just has to be final. I stepped out into the cold night air. The wind felt good on my face. It felt clean. Behind me, in the slaughterhouse, the Italians were learning a lesson they would never forget. They were learning that Frank Lucas wasn't just a gangster. I was an intelligence agency. I was a surveillance state. I lit a cigarette, my hand perfectly steady. The flame illuminated the darkness for a second. I took a drag and exhaled a long plume of smoke that drifted up toward the winter stars. I had cut the cancer out. It hurt. It hurt like hell to lose Nate. I loved that boy. But love is a luxury in this business, and I couldn't afford luxuries. I could only afford discipline. As we drove back to Harlem, I looked at the city skyline. It looked different to me now. It wasn't just buildings and lights. It was a grid of information, a web, and I sat at the center of the web. The Italians thought they were the predators because they had history. They didn't realize that history is just a story written by the winner, and tonight, I had picked up the pen. I remembered Bumpy Johnson telling me about the time he swapped the wine glasses. He said, "Frank, the trick isn't being faster than the other guy. The trick is knowing what the other guy's going to do before he even knows it himself." I had known. I had watched Nate for weeks. I had tested him, fed him false info, watched where he took it. I gave him every chance to be loyal, and he chose to be a king. Now he was just meat, hanging in a locker in the meatpacking district. A warning to anyone else who thought the crown looked light. That night changed me. Before the slaughterhouse, I was a businessman. After the slaughterhouse, I was a myth. Word got out. It always does. People whispered that Frank Lucas knew what you were dreaming about. They whispered that the walls had ears and the ears belonged to me. The Italians backed off. The police who weren't on the payroll got scared. The dealers on the street stopped skimming off the top because they were terrified that I would know. And I would know. I went back to my penthouse. I poured a glass of cognac. I sat by the window and watched the sun come up over the Harlem River. The sky turned a bruised purple, then a bleeding red. I was alone. That's the part they don't tell you about power. The higher you go, the fewer people can breathe the air up there with you. You end up standing on the mountaintop, looking down at the clouds, realizing that the only person you can trust is the one looking back at you in the mirror. But I accepted it. I drank the cognac. It burned going down, a good burn. I had survived the betrayal. I had survived the conspiracy. I had stared into the eyes of the 5 families and made them blink. I was the king of Harlem. And long live the king. But even kings have blind spots. I was so focused on the Italians, so focused on the traitors inside my camp, that I didn't see the other storm brewing. I didn't see the man in the cheap suit, the honest cop who couldn't be bought, the one man in New York City who didn't care about money or fear. Richie Roberts. While I was playing chess with the mob, he was playing a different game entirely. He was gathering evidence. He was building a case. He was coming for me. Not with a gun, but with the law. And the law, as I was about to find out, is the only thing colder than a meat locker in January. There is a specific kind of cold that settles over the Hudson River in January. It isn't just weather. It is a physical weight. A gray blanket of ice that traps the exhaust fumes and the misery of the city down at street level. When you are standing in the meatpacking district at midnight, listening to the wind rattle the corrugated iron of a slaughterhouse, you learn the difference between being a tough guy and being a businessman. A tough guy brings a gun to a meeting because he expects a fight. A businessman brings leverage because he has already won the fight before he even stepped out of his car. The Italians called this meeting because they thought they had the upper hand. They thought they had checkmate. They didn't understand that I wasn't playing chess. I was playing solitaire, and I was the only one holding the deck. I checked my reflection in the window of the Cadillac. My suit was custom sharkskin, tailored in Milan, the tie was silk and the overcoat was cashmere. I didn't dress for the weather. I dressed for the occasion. Presentation is half the battle. If you look like a victim, you become one. If you look like the CEO of a multinational corporation, people hesitate. And in that hesitation, you own them. I looked at Jackson in the driver's seat. He was gripping the wheel, his knuckles white. He knew what was waiting inside. He knew who was waiting inside. I put a hand on his shoulder, not to comfort him, but to steady him. Panic is a vibration, and it spreads. I needed him solid as concrete. We walked toward the warehouse entrance. The smell hit me first. Old copper, wet sawdust, and the lingering metallic scent of blood that never really scrubs out of the concrete. It was theater. The mob loved their theater. They wanted to meet here, surrounded by hanging carcasses and meat hooks, because they wanted me to feel small. They wanted to remind me that, in their eyes, I was just another animal to be processed. I walked through the main floor, my footsteps echoing on the slick floor. Sides of beef hung from the ceiling on chains, swaying slightly in the draft like a forest of dead things. I didn't look at them. I kept my eyes on the door at the back, the one with the single naked bulb swinging above it. Inside the office, the air was thick with cigar smoke and arrogance. Sal Tessiero sat behind a metal desk that looked like it had been salvaged from a submarine. He was a capo in the Genovese family, a man whose reputation was built on a foundation of broken kneecaps and missing witnesses. Standing next to him was Paulie, a representative for the Chin, looking at me with eyes that were dead flat, like a shark's. And in the corner, sitting on a wooden chair, staring at his own shoes, was Nate, my cousin, my blood. The boy I had pulled out of the dirt in North Carolina and put in a penthouse. He was shaking. He was wearing the leather jacket I bought him for Christmas, and he looked small inside it. He didn't look up when I walked in. He couldn't. Sal smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. He leaned back, the springs of the chair groaning. He told me I was a hard man to reach. He told me that my business model was disrupting the natural order of things. He spoke about the ecosystem of the city, about how the 5 families had built a structure, and how I was kicking out the support beams. It was a speech I had heard 1,000 times in different forms. It was the speech of a dinosaur complaining about the meteor. He wanted me to buy from them. He wanted 30% of the blue magic trade. He wanted me to kiss the ring. And then he played his ace. He pointed to Nate. Sal told me that Nate had sung. He told me that my own flesh and blood had given them everything. The locations of the stash houses, the schedule of the planes coming into the private airfields in North Carolina, the names of the Asian contacts in the Golden Triangle. Sal looked at me with a triumphant sneer, waiting for me to crumble. He thought he had stripped me naked. He thought he had the keys to the kingdom. He gave me a choice: retire and hand over the operation, or die right there on the slaughterhouse floor while Nate took over my chair. I didn't scream. I didn't reach for the gun in my waistband. I lit a cigarette. I took my time, shielding the flame of the lighter with my hand, inhaling deeply and letting the smoke drift up toward the stained ceiling tiles. I looked at Sal. Then I looked at Paulie, and finally, I rested my eyes on Nate. I felt a profound sadness, not for myself, but for the waste of it all. Potential is a rare commodity, and seeing it rot is a tragedy. I reached into the inside pocket of my coat. The 2 soldiers behind Sal twitched, their hands going to their jackets. I didn't flinch. I pulled out a manila envelope, thick and sealed with wax. I tossed it onto the metal desk. It landed with a heavy slap that sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. I told Sal to open it. He hesitated, confused by my calm, confused by the fact that I wasn't begging for my life. He opened the envelope and pulled out a stack of photographs and a reel-to-reel tape transcript. I watched his face change. It was a slow transformation, like watching milk spoil. I explained to him that the man driving his car, the man he trusted to take his mother to church on Sundays, had a gambling problem that I had purchased 3 months ago. I owned his debt, which meant I owned his ears. I told Paulie that his mistress at the Copacabana, the one he whispered secrets to after 3 martinis, was on my payroll. I knew about this meeting before they had even decided on the location. I knew exactly what they offered Nate at that diner on Queens Boulevard. $200,000 and a promise of power. A cheap price for a soul. Then I turned to Nate. He was looking at me now, tears streaming down his face, mixing with the sweat of his terror. I asked him if he really thought I would send him to inspect a warehouse that actually held my product. I asked him if he thought the flight schedules I left on my desk were for real planes. I told him that the information he sold to the Italians was a ghost. The warehouses were empty. The planes didn't exist. The routes were dead ends. He had sold them nothing but air. The silence in that room was absolute. The mechanical hum of the freezer unit seemed to get louder. Sal looked at the transcript, then at me, then at his soldiers. He did the math. He realized that if he killed me, he gained nothing but a war he couldn't afford based on intelligence that was worthless. But more importantly, he realized that I had compromised his entire operation. I knew where he slept. I knew where he hid his skim. I knew the names of the judges he bribed. I had demonstrated that while they were playing gangster, I was playing intelligence agency. I wasn't just a supplier, I was the surveillance state. I stood up. I buttoned my coat. I told Sal that the new deal was very simple. There was no 30%. There was no partnership. They would stay out of my way. They would let the blue magic flow, and in exchange, I wouldn't mail those transcripts to the FBI or the IRS. I wouldn't burn their world down with the information I held. I offered them their lives in exchange for their silence. It was the same deal Bumpy Johnson had made, refined for a new era. Sal nodded. It was a small, stiff movement, but it was a surrender. He signaled his men to stand down. They understood leverage. They respected power. And tonight, I was the most powerful man in New York City. I started walking toward the door. Nate called out my name. It was a broken, desperate sound. He begged me. He said he was sorry. He said we were family. I stopped with my hand on the doorknob. I didn't turn around. I couldn't look at him. If I looked at him, I might remember the boy who used to catch fireflies in the backyard in North Carolina. I might remember the cousin who stood back to back with me in the pool halls. But that boy was dead. He died the moment he sat down in the diner and decided he wanted to be the king. I spoke to the room, but the words were for Jackson, who was waiting in the shadows of the hallway. I said that family is determined by loyalty, not blood. I said that a traitor is a cancer, and you don't negotiate with cancer. You cut it out. I walked out of the office and closed the door behind me. I walked through the hanging carcasses, my steps steady, my rhythm unchanged. Behind me, there was no gunshot. Gunshots attract police. There was just a scuffle, a muffled cry, and the wet, heavy sound of a mistake being corrected. I stepped out into the freezing night air. The wind hit my face and it felt clean. It felt like baptism. I lit another cigarette, my hand perfectly steady. I had walked into the lion's den and turned the lions into kittens. I had secured my empire. I had proven that Frank Lucas could not be touched, could not be outsmarted, and could not be betrayed without consequence. But as I looked at the smoke curling up toward the winter stars, I felt the cold settle deep in my bones. I had the crown, and I had the city, but I had left a piece of my humanity on the floor of that slaughterhouse. That is the price of the ticket. You pay it, or you don't ride. And I was going to ride this until the wheels fell off. The days following that night at the slaughterhouse were the quietest of my life. You might expect a war. You might expect car bombs, drive-by shootings, the kind of messy, loud violence that makes the 6 o'clock news. But there was no war. There was only silence. And in that silence, I heard the sound of victory. The Italians didn't retaliate because you don't shoot the goose that lays the golden eggs, even if that goose just cut your cousin's throat. They understood the new math. I had the supply, I had the intelligence, and I had the leverage. 3 days later, a package arrived at my headquarters. It wasn't a bomb. It was a bottle of wine. Chateau Margaux, 1937. The same vintage Bumpy Johnson used to kill a traitor, sent to me by Sal Tessiero. There was no note. There didn't need to be. It was a concession. It was an admission that the Genovese family was no longer the landlord of Harlem. They were now just another customer. From that day forward, the Italians bought blue magic at my price, on my schedule, and they said, "Thank you," when they picked it up. I had achieved the impossible. I had gentrified the underworld. I took a street-level hustle and turned it into a vertically integrated international corporation. We were moving $1 million a day. A day. I had counting houses that ran 24 hours a day just to keep up with the cash flow. We were buying real estate, laundromats, dry cleaners, anything to wash the money. I was the Federal Reserve of Harlem. But when you stand on top of the mountain, the wind is different. It's colder. Bumpy Johnson used to tell me that a king has no friends, only subjects and enemies. I looked around my table, at the country boys, at Jackson, and I realized Bumpy was right. They respected me, they feared me, but they didn't know me. They looked at me and saw a paycheck. They saw the suits and the cars and the power, but they didn't see the weight of it. They didn't see Nate's face in the dark when I closed my eyes. That is the true cost of the crown. It isn't the danger. I never minded the danger. It is the isolation. You become a monument to your own ambition. I walked down 116th Street, and people parted like the Red Sea. They whispered my name like a prayer or a curse. "There goes Frank Lucas," they'd say. "The man who beat the white man at his own game." And they were right. I didn't just break the glass ceiling, I bought the building and evicted the tenants. I sat in my office, looking at the map on the wall. Southeast Asia to North Carolina to New York, a straight line of pure profit. I had cut out the middlemen, the parasites, and the doubts. I had built something that would be studied, analyzed, and mythologized for decades. They would call me a monster, they would call me a genius, but they would never call me a subordinate. I poured a glass of that Chateau Margaux. I drank it for Bumpy. I drank it for the boys in the jungle. I drank it for the Harlem that raised me and the America that tried to break me. I had won. But as I set the glass down, I knew the truth. In this life, you don't get to retire. There is no sunset to ride off into. There is only the climb, and then inevitably the fall. But looking out at my city, shining in the winter light, I knew one thing for sure. It was a hell of a view from the top. My name is Frank Lucas. I was the architect of the greatest smuggling operation in history. I was the man who walked between the raindrops. If you want to understand how the world really works, how power is taken and not given, then you are in the right place. Subscribe to this channel. Like this video if you respect the hustle. And tell me in the comments, when the world tries to put you in a box, do you accept the walls or do you tear them down? Until next time.